Good afternoon to everybody. Probably we are in front of the most difficult panel of this day. It's the most difficult because we just finished our lunch, and the panels after lunch are known to be the most difficult in the world. But I'm more than confident that we are brave and courageous, and we will manage to do it. First, I would like to thank panelists who were able to join us today, and they are with us. And on the panel, hybrid panel, I would say, I still don't see it, but it is supposed to be hybrid panel called European Security and Asymmetric Threats. On the spot, we will have 5 speakers, and 2 are supposed to join us via digital. Yes, one is this. I don't see it here. Yes, okay. And Ms. Kanderbach is as well. So we are all connected, I see. So altogether, there will be 7 speakers, plus me as a moderator. The panelists will have each in the first round about 5 to 7 minutes for the answer, because altogether we have 80 minutes time slot. And then we will proceed with questions and answers from the public, approximately around 3 and 10. And if time will permit us, then we will follow the second round of questions and rapidly wrapping up by each panelist with the final comments, and I will conclude the panel afterwards. Let me present our today's guests or speakers. First is Ambassador Bettina Kanderbach. Yeah, it's much more easier to see the speakers there than here. But Ambassador Bettina Kanderbach is a NATO Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy, also a former German ambassador to various countries. Then we have Slovenian Minister of Defense, Matej Tonin. He is also president of the government coalition party Nova Slovenia. He is also a former president of the Slovenian parliament and also a former member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We have officer in charge of Secretary General Miss Tula Jirjola, who is also a director of the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center. We have Lieutenant General Christopher Cavoli, commander of US Army Europe. We have Deputy Assistant Secretary in Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, Mr. Matt Boyce. And we have also Managing Director for CSDP and Crisis Response European External Action Service, Mr. Pavel Herczynski, who is with us in the digital mode because of a new wave of COVID-19 problems that are arising around in Europe. And finally, Professor Dr. Matthew Rhodes, Professor of National Security Studies and Area Studies Chair at the Marshall Center. And I have to say that this panel is performed by Blatt Strategic Forum in cooperation, in partnership, I would say, with George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies and Ministry of Defense of Republic of Slovenia. And I would like to thank both of our partners for the help and participation in the panel. My name is Istok Mirosic. I'm ambassador at large in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, special envoy of the minister, and the director of the programs of the Blatt Strategic Forum. Very briefly, a few words, what's the intention of the panel? Well, this discussion or the panel is inspired by current developments in Europe, in NATO, OSCE, EU, and transatlantic relations regarding security issues as a consequence of the vibrant political security events and changes complicated also by COVID-19 pandemic. After the end of Cold War, probably the European security architecture has never been under more stress than it is today. And our perception of European security might be influenced by rapidly changing security challenges, from mere conventional challenges to asymmetric challenges. And by asymmetric threats or challenges, I mean use of hybrid tools of warfare and influence on social, economic and political state of alliance, union or particular member state. So asymmetric threats pose new pressures on the European post-Cold War security architecture and arrangements. And the COVID-19 crisis contributed to the existing challenges by causing suspension of, for example, verification activities, confidence and security building measures, while encouraging on the other side the disinformation campaigns. For the purpose of the discussion, as I said, asymmetric threats are considered as new hybrid threats, and they are more and more used to challenge the continental security. In the center of this debate is resilience, concept of resilience of the societies or countries. Main question is also general erosion of trust between and among different actors in the European security arena. And by this, the intentional debate is also to explore the role of new actors that have become a part of European security environment. Consequently, we wouldn't be able to escape probably the role of multilateralism in a geopolitical global reality. And European security is therefore seems to be increasingly precarious, while the possibility of another COVID-19 wave could put new strains on national defense systems. So the questions, what is the future of arms control in Europe, how we rebuild the trust between principal actors, how we can manage meaningful dialogue between about asymmetric threats between these actors, what are the prospects for the post-COVID European security architecture and the cooperation EU-NATO are the questions that probably will be at stake today. But let me go directly to our interlocutors, and first to Ambassador Bettina Kanderbach. Good afternoon. Do we hear? Afternoon. Oh, we hear each other, so everything is okay. So security architecture in Europe is rapidly changing. We have erosions of security arrangements regarding, for example, a New START, Open Skies Treaty. COVID-19 brings new challenges. Health crisis can turn into security crisis. Situation in Eastern Europe is very, very fluid. Belarus is in the midst of our attention with possible Russian intervention. We still need a strong and resilient NATO. The problem is that French president last year called it a brain dead organization. And that's why I want to ask, what is the influence of the COVID pandemic on the traditional security challenges and new hybrid asymmetric threats? And what influence does it have on the relations among allies? We see the tensions between Greece and Turkey in Mediterranean, US and Germany relations. So do we have a NATO COVID action plan, pandemic response plan?
Well, let me start by repeating something that the Secretary General has said from the outset, and that is, for us, the most important issue is that this health crisis cannot turn into a security crisis. This cannot be overstated, because you need to see the backdrop, and the backdrop is that state actors, they have an ongoing attempt to take advantage of this health crisis to promote their own authoritarian model of governance as the most efficient and the most desirable. Non-state actors repeat this, they do the same thing. There is a spread of disinformation, there is the use of cyberspace, there is other, as you called them, hybrid threats aimed at us, aimed at our societies. So what we are, in essential, what it is that we are looking at is the weaponizing of non-military instruments, which is the use of cyberspace, of the information domain, of infrastructure projects, of the chain of supply. All of that is part of the systemic rivalry that we are seeing right now. These are trends that have started long before that pandemic, but this pandemic really put this into sharp relief. It put it into focus, what is going on there. And there, in order to look at what is happening, we have to try to find a way and also to project into the future what might be our response to that. The same is when we look at global arms control. The architecture, that this architecture is eroding is an ongoing trend. COVID-19 has sharpened this erosion and has pointed us to what was really going on there, because we downsized our exercises. Suddenly, inspections were no longer possible. Verification became a very big issue. None of that could happen because of the COVID crisis. So the question is, what are the answers that we can give when we look at this whole situation? So if we look at the kind of post-COVID European security architecture as ASG PASP, of course, I would say European and transatlantic security architecture. First of all, we have to be aware we are a very, very long way from being post-COVID. So the only thing we can do at this stage is we look at the initial lessons learned and we try to adapt our policies and our defense on the situation as we are. So let me just very briefly mention a couple of lessons, just touch upon them. We need to look at our own non-military instruments of power, and we have to use them to advance ours, which is the Western democracy's strategic interest. First and foremost, here at NATO, strengthening NATO's political dimension, including partnership, including close cooperation with other international organizations. This is what is at the core of the Secretary General's NATO 2030 agenda. I think we will come back to that at a later moment. The second lesson is we have to look at new and non-traditional areas of defense, which is climate change, cyber, space. We have to look at that. We have to formulate answers. This is where arms control comes into. We have to maintain our commitment to arms control, but we also have to adapt arms control as a key element to our security. We have to look at new technologies, and then we have to see which are the partners with whom we can work on a new governance of new technologies. These are unstructured. They just exist. We have nothing yet to control it, to build transparency, to build confidence in all of that. So that is where multilateralism comes in, because there we have to look at what is it that we can do with other international actors, because it's clear that this is not something NATO can do all by itself. We have to look at the others. Who are there? Who are the ones that we can work with? Of course, the natural partner always is the European Union, because when we talk about the systemic rivalry, what is it that we are talking about? We are talking about the defense of our democracies, and NATO and the EU, we are kind of the geographic dimension of what we call the West. So it's clear that we are the two organizations that have to work the closest. But then, of course, we can do a lot if we work with the OSCE, where some work is already going on, where arms control is really at the core of their security dimension. And then, of course, we look at the United Nations, because there also we have learned during the COVID crisis how much we can achieve when we all work together. I will stop here with my initial remarks, and according to interest that you have, we can go deeper into all the different areas that I've touched upon.
NATO 2030. So I just wanted to ask you about the reflection process that NATO launched. Are these plans also part of the reflection process that is going on?
Part of the reflection process is being conducted right now under the aegis of the Secretary General. He has put in place a group, an expert group, which is going to inform that process. That is an independent group. That's important to understand. It's a group of independent experts coming up with their recommendations, and then the Secretary General will decide how to proceed from there. Of course, allies are involved in terms of there is interaction with the North Atlantic Council, but then, of course, they are going to have an interaction with capitals and with also with think tanks and non-governmental organizations. What is at the core of the Secretary General's NATO 2030 process is the alliance has to remain militarily strong. We have to be politically united, and we have to take a broader global approach, not meaning that NATO has to be all over the globe, but we have to be aware that challenges and threats in this day and age, they are not geographically confined, and we have to be able to cope with that. And that is what at the core of NATO 2030. How do we prepare? In what ways do we need to prepare? What are the new actors, and can we engage with these new actors, and do these new actors want to engage with NATO?
Very much, Mr. Minister. COVID-19 pandemic. Working? Yeah. Maybe. Okay. Can you turn off the microphones? Another one. Okay, Mr. Minister, yeah, it doesn't work. Another one, Mike. Working? It's on another microphone. Mr. Minister, COVID-19 pandemic brought huge pressures on national economies and financial systems. The burden of healing will be not just healing people, but societies, and it will be enormous. Global economic recession is knocking on the door, possibly. At the same time, the security challenges and threats in Europe are becoming, as we heard, more and more complex. So basically, what does this mean for financial budgets and spendings for defense and security of member countries? Will health, economic and social consequences of pandemic influence, particularly Slovenian national defense system and finances? And is Slovenia a reliable ally according to the Welsh commitments? And we just heard Ambassador Bettina Kanderbach that we might envisage also the operations of NATO outside the European territory. So are we prepared for that one, or are we preparing for that one?
Mr. Ambassador, the right question at the right time. You know that this week will be especially important for our ministry, for our bill, which will decide how much we will invest in the future in the military. But before that, I would like to thank all panelists, and I'm privileged to be part of this panel, so thank you very much for attending that strategic forum. As you mentioned in the beginning, you said that I was in a previous job representative of Slovenian parliament in NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I was member of Science and Technology Committee, and we had an excellent experience, excellent trip to Norfolk. I see many military officers, they know what Norfolk represents for US military, and there we were able to embark aircraft carrier Ike. Amazing ship. I was asking how much is it costs. In the end, they answered me, you won't believe that operational costs of aircraft carrier Ike equals Slovenian annual defense budget. So that we can compare where we are in comparison with our allies. So aircraft carrier is a great asset. I was joking at that time, look, maybe Americans can borrow us an aircraft carrier and we will spend our defense budget with the aircraft carrier and we will become a superpower. Bad joke, obviously. But look at now. With the COVID, this important asset can be totally paralyzed. This is what COVID maybe means. One example. Another example, many of you probably remember was what has happened in Estonia in 2007. I hope I'm not too harsh to say that I have good evidence that behind of this action was probably someone from the East. but without any tank, without any airplane, they were able to paralyze Estonia for 14 days. In 2015, we have another example in Ukraine. 200,000 inhabitants in the middle of strong winter was without electric power. Again, simple cyber attack. So, because we have many experts who can go in details, I would say that this would be my line and my line of, and the line of our ministry, that with the conventional capabilities, the right word is adopt. We have to adopt on a new normal, on the world after COVID, how to live with the COVID, so how to keep operational conventional capabilities. I think that the magic word is we have to adopt. And then we have another magic word, which is developed, that we have developed new capabilities in cyberspace. I will never forget one Dutch senator who said, look, I know that 16 NATO member states has offensive, not only defensive, but offensive cyber capabilities. And that's the only way, and that's the best way how we can defend. And we were asking him, what do you mean? He said, look, we had some Russian hackers who were attacking all the time some of our institutions, and then one time our offensive capabilities were able to identify Russian hacker, switch him a light in his apartment, and send him an email. That's a warning. Another time, we will act differently. And I think this is the best way how to make cyber defense. So we have to develop new capabilities, and now we come to Slovenia and to your question. Yeah, definitely we have to invest more. That's why I'm very happy that we are investing more, especially in cyber security and cyber capability. I have to thank here our allies because they are helping us to develop these capabilities, and it will be a huge step forward. That's one thing. And your last part of the question, are we reliable partner? Even though that I'm a minister, I have to be honest, until now we weren't reliable partner. Because in our strategic documents and papers, we were writing so many different things that we will do that, and we never deliver. We never fulfill our promises. And that's why we have to change. Right now we have to act dramatically different, and that's why I'm happy that I'm part of this government which has totally different approach. And yes, this week, it's important week for our bill, which will provide additional money for the military. Not for the NATO, but for the Slovenian armed forces. And when I came to the Ministry of Defense, I didn't start with the white papers, with the strategies and so on, because we have so many fancy strategies. We just have to fulfill them. We just have to deliver. And if you want to deliver, you need money. And that's why I'm repeating all the time that September is important month for the Slovenian defense, for our credibility within the alliance, that even the auditorium in this public will help us to convince people that we need this because of ourselves, not because of NATO or some other institutions.
So you do not expect any problems because of the COVID possible next wave on the budgetary?
I expect many problems. You know, you can witness many critics that now the deficit is too big. If we wouldn't invest so much in different fields, they would say, especially opposition, why didn't give so much money to that and there and so on. You know, it's always it's a political story. But in a way, COVID is a good thing as well for defense. Why? Because under the COVID or with the COVID, we are able to get money from different European funds, from different institutions, and that is opening new possibilities for defense budget. I think, to be very honest with you, that without COVID, I'm not so convinced that we would have so many space and that we will be able to provide so much money for defense, because the COVID enabling us new possibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. From your mouth to God's ears, they would say. Madam Jurjula, two brief and very actual questions, and very easy questions. The center of the OSCE activities in recent days is Belarus. What do you think? And this represents a new security escalation era in Europe, that OSCE will have to be even more active than it is probably? What is the current role of the OSCE in the case? Mission of the presidency? Vienna, Moscow mechanism? How to really establish a dialogue on Belarus, not to turn it into a geopolitical questions, since we know that trust inside the organization among the principal stakeholders is very fragile.
Thank you for the easy question. My colleagues back in Vienna gave me a whole bunch of things to read to you, but let me try to answer. Well, yeah, indeed it is at the center of our attention right now, although that doesn't mean that it is the only thing that we are working on. For example, Ukraine continues to be on the agenda as well. Well, I think I would assume many of you know how the OSCE has been engaged in recent days, well after the situation in Belarus became apparent. And the chairperson in office, the chairmanship, which is the Albanian chairmanship this year, has actively voiced their concern on the developments. ODIHR is also the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights is also, of course, following very closely the handling of protests, detentions, media, so forth, and all the disturbing reports that we have of, for example, mistreatment of detained persons. So the basic starting point, obviously, for a value-based organization such as the OSCE is that we do have the OSCE commitments and principles that every participating state, including Belarus, should respect, including freedom of assembly and expression. Now, we held a special meeting of the Permanent Council last week. The chairmanship, together with the incoming chair, Sweden, they have suggested to the Belarusian authorities a visit of the Troika. Troika also includes the previous chairmanship, meaning Slovakia, of the Troika to Belarus to open up dialogue. And I think we all continue, and I'm also in this sense now speaking on behalf of the chairmanship, although with not having asked for permission from them to say this, but I think I know what they're thinking. But I mean, really, the idea is that really the first step is, and hopefully Belarus will accept this, is to establish dialogue, because that's how we should proceed, rather than through some, shall we say, forcible means in a way, and I'll get back to that in just one second. So anyway, so dialogue has been suggested. The special Permanent Council on Friday, I think, very much strengthened this message to Belarus, because we also had a lot of strong support from other participating states. There were a number of high officials from other states also attending in person, in addition to the chairperson in office, the Albanian Prime Minister Rama. There have been contacts with Belarus, also with Russia. Understandably, as we know, Russia is very concerned from perhaps a bit of a different angle, but nevertheless concerned about the situation in Belarus, and obviously also very much cooperation and contacts with other international organizations, including also cooperation, or rather coordination with the EU and discussion. So first thing, really, the OSCE, and this message has been very strong from the EU also side, is that the OSCE is the proper organization to deal with this crisis, not the least because Belarus is also a member of the organization, a participating state. And right now, the way the situation is that, so as I said, it's about dialogue in the first instance, hopefully. The other possibilities, and this would be something that would come from the participating states side, would be invoking the human dimension mechanism or mechanisms that can be invoked ad hoc by participating states. There is the Vienna Mechanism, which is essentially about questions, ad hoc, questions to a participating state where there are human rights issues. And then the, let's say, stronger mechanism is the so-called Moscow mechanism, which provides actually for ad hoc missions of independent experts that would address specific human dimension problems. So this would be for the participating states to activate. It would be supported by ODIHR. And the first thing would be to identify the question or the questions that need to be addressed. So this is something, so it takes some weeks to activate. And then it also depends on the country in question, in this case Belarus, whether they would cooperate or not. This is the one mechanism that the OSCE has where the country in question does not necessarily need to cooperate for it to be invoked. But of course, again, we are still hopeful that could be done with cooperation. And the Moscow mechanism was activated in 2011 after the presidential elections in Belarus in 2010, so this would not be the first time. And at that time, Belarus did not cooperate. So that's where we are essentially with this right now, but really truly hoping that we could advance on this through dialogue.
And possibly solution through the dialogue. Just one brief question, I don't know whether you can comment or not, but it is also seen some divisions. I mentioned before lack of trust inside the organization regarding, it is reflected probably also in the process of finding new leadership of the OSCE. Can you comment whether this is an obstacle for the work of the OSCE or not? How do you see it? Is influencing the activities that OSCE is supposed to take care, especially in the security area?
Yeah, well, I think I cannot deny the lack of trust. Certainly that shows up. I think it has been something that relates very much to a more general question of the, there seems to be, to my mind, it's sort of more a global situation where, let's say, the power and value of multilateral cooperation and multilateralism in general has maybe been forgotten, and that influences everything. So the OSCE is not in a vacuum, and that means that obviously it is made up of 57.
It's not because you're present here.
Am I causing the lack of trust? I'm sorry about that. No, but I mean, it is a bigger issue because, of course, what is reflected in the OSCE is 57 participating states and their relations. And what is also reflected, one has to admit, is the fact that things have not gotten any better since 2014 when the crisis in and around Ukraine started. So we do have divisions, but let's say, I think still, this leadership situation that you referred to is, I wouldn't dare talk about lack of trust. I would talk about rather, or at least in the same sense, shall we say, but I would say that came about with disagreements about the role of the different, we have 4 different institutions essentially, or executive structures. There's a secretariat, which now I am representing as the officer in charge, but there is also the representative on freedom of media. So one participating state was unhappy with the representative of freedom of media. That's when the package of 4 top appointments started falling apart. Another one was unhappy with freedom of media and ODIHR, so human dimension, and then it led to this situation. So it was perhaps you could say well, unhappiness rather than lack of trust to these executive structures and independent institutions in particular that play a certain role that relates to the OSCE commitments and principles. So all the participating states have signed on to them, but perhaps not all of them are at the same stage of agreeing exactly on how these should be respected, and that's what led to it.
Okay, thank you very much. If we move to more realistic terrain, General Cavoli, I'm more than sure that you don't want to talk about politics. You would like to be more terrain-based and what's happening on the spot with the military. And I just wonder how this COVID-19 influences the direct military activities. For example, Defender 2020 exercise, if you say if our security is endangered or not regarding this pandemic wave. The other is that I think the general public perception, and I don't want to ask you about the redeployments of the US Army from Germany, but the general public perception is that maybe Americans are retreating from Europe, and they are expecting that probably Europeans will take a greater part to take care of their own security. If I'm a little bit provocative, do you see such events developing, meaning NATO is basically the main principal defense organization in Europe, but there are a lot of activities inside the European Union that would like to shape a sort of strategic autonomy.
Sure. Let me work backwards. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation, Minister, Ambassador. Thank you. No, absolutely not. I do not see the United States backing away from Europe or backing away from NATO. My presence here is evidence of that, I would say. But there's more evidence. So today I have about 35,000 US soldiers spread around 16 countries in Europe and Israel. So the commitment is real, it's there. My budget was just shy of $3 billion last year to conduct operations and training on the European continent and to perform readiness activities. So no, it's very real, the US commitment. In fact, some of you may have noticed that just last month, the United States activated the 4th Corps headquarters in its inventory, which is called the 5th Corps. And the 5th Corps is dedicated to European operations and European planning. There will be a forward headquarters of that Corps located in Poznań, Poland. And in fact, the brand new Lieutenant General who's been appointed to command that received his promotion there on the site. So this was not just symbolic, but it's a very practical contribution and demonstration of our continued commitment. You are correct, however, sir. We do expect our allies to contribute in a new and more forceful way, if I can build on what the minister said. When we look at our current posture, if we contemplate large-scale operations, the United States has evolved into a position of reinforcement rather than forward presence. That reinforcement takes time because of the space between here and where our soldiers are actually located in the United States. That time needs to be filled by forces that are present on the continent, our allies who are here. So the current readiness and the genuine capabilities of those forces is paramount to our collective defense of the territory of NATO. And here I applaud those countries that are skillfully and thoughtfully expending their Wales contribution on their Wales commitment on 2%. I am very, very happy to see that Slovenia has a plan now to get there by 2026, and I think that's fundamental to the way we operate. This frontline readiness of our allies with the US preparing to do a large reinforcement only works successfully, though, if the US can do that large-scale reinforcement. So over the past years, we have been rehearsing at smaller scale reinforcement capabilities, and then reception and staging and onward movement of those forces once they get to the continent. Defender 20 was going to be the biggest test of that, and it would have been the biggest test in, about 25 years. So we staged this exercise in conjunction with our allies to test our ability to deploy an operationally significant large-scale force forward. In fact, it was curtailed somewhat by COVID, but ironically, the most important parts for us actually did take place. We moved 13,000 pieces of equipment from the United States to Europe and got them staged forward into intermediate assembly areas. We flew over 10,000 US soldiers to aerial ports of debarkation here and matched them up with equipment. But in the end, we had to curtail the actual tactical activities on the ground. We did do some things, and this comes to your point about COVID. In the northwest of Poland at Drawska Pomorskia training area, we resurrected an operation with the Polish army in which we brought 7,000 US and Polish soldiers together and conducted a live exercise to practice crossing a river. And that exercise was completely free play. It was live force on force, and it was held across 2.5 weeks. Every soldier who went into that training area was tested, and when proven negative, was released into the training area, and then on the way out, every soldier was tested and sent home. And we did that with 0 positive cases. That has set the standard for the way we conduct training now. Just last week, I had a 4,000 soldier exercise with allies at our training area in Hohenfels. Every soldier tested in, every soldier participated, every soldier tested out, Slovenian soldiers as well. And by complying with these protocols, we have been able to sustain readiness. As I talk to my colleagues across the alliance, that is what we are all doing. We don't want this to be the new normal because, as the minister and I discussed a little bit earlier, it costs time. We have to isolate soldiers for 10 or 14 days before bringing them together for exercises. But it is possible, and it is critical for us to sustain our readiness in this way.
General, if we move further, Deputy Assistant Secretary Mr. Boy's 3Cs initiative is meant to bridge infrastructural and energy gaps, boost mobility and digitalization. The aim is to strengthen transatlantic cooperation and to cope with also with the new security and hybrid challenges from 2 actors. One is probably Russia, and the other is a new one, that is China, coping with them by strategic investments in Central Europe. The 3Cs initiative emphasizes the importance of critical infrastructure of member countries. So can it help practically to elevate the general economic security and, of course, communication resilience of these member countries because of also Chinese penetration to Central and Southeastern Europe. Is this penetration also perceived as a security threat and is a part of the 3Cs initiative?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ambassador, for organizing this conference. I must say it's incredibly nice to be able to actually interact with people in real live form, rather than electronically or on telephones or on Zoom or otherwise. It really is. You cannot imagine how nice it is to actually to resume doing what we do normally. And thank you for taking the risk as well, because of course this wasn't easy to organize. So on the subject of hybrid, there's a huge body of corpus of literature on this done by all sorts of centers of excellence, and the EU has done some tremendous work on this. Think tanks. I mean, there's universities. I mean, there's just an enormous amount. So we understand the way Russia has been. It's the Kremlin toolkit, as it were. So how they've been approaching Central Europe, the three Cs member states, as you asked. So we understand that pretty well. We've been also attempting to blunt that, but that's of course an ongoing and a long-term challenge, quite frankly. The newer actor in this, of course, is China, and we see through the 17+1 initiative that they're operating in a different way. The Russian approach is sort of more of what we've seen with Russia over time, over decades. But with China, it's more of an economic challenge. The attempt to turn countries of this region eastward to undermine their societies in the sense that they're to dangle the economic advantages of trade and investment and to try to encourage or co-opt or otherwise elites and others to looking east and to being more focused on the rather than on the West, where your countries are culturally, historically, and otherwise. So this is a long-term challenge. Now, of course, I won't get into an assessment of 17+1 necessarily, but the way that China has been operating is to at least in that way, although we actually do see, quite frankly, we see that the COVID crisis has brought out new forms of Chinese activity that are not part of the sort of the 17+1 or that we see, for example, the Chinese instrumentalizing or even weaponizing this crisis to present itself as, instead of hoping that people will forget that the virus originated in China and that it is, to a large extent, as a result of their actions that we are in this predicament and we've had this crisis in the first place, that our economies and our societies have lost vast trillions of dollars in terms of value over the course of this crisis, hoping that we'd forget that, and then they present themselves as the savior, as sort of flying in masks and respirators and whatever, ventilators as which they've usually sold rather than donated, and some of which some of the recipient countries have found the quality lacking. And then of course some of the countries that have been recipients of this have, in addition to having paid for them and having sometimes of lesser quality, also finding themselves in the awkward situation of having the Chinese ambassador say, well, you, politician X, shall appear at the airport to receive these goods and to make a big public splash and to present themselves as the savior. So we have that sort of weaponization or instrumentalization of the crisis to try to build up to get people to sort of to confuse populations about what the origin and what the problem really was. But then you have and then, of course, just today and yesterday and the last few days, you've seen the Chinese foreign minister traveling around Europe and threatening the Norwegians, saying, sort of advising them whom they should not think about awarding the Nobel Prize to. Then you have the threatening the Czechs today, sort of saying that because the Czech president of the Senate had the audacity to fly to Taiwan with a bunch of other businessmen and otherwise, that there will be a high price to pay. And this is, of course, in addition to the other threats that we've seen, sort of the more subtle ones, where the Chinese ambassador in countries X or Y or Z will say, well, that's a very nice Volkswagen factory you have in China. It'd be a shame if anything were to happen to it. Or similar threats comments we've seen like that in Switzerland and other countries. So we've seen sort of the use of the crisis to confuse and to try to shape the narrative. But going back to the three C's, because the Chinese approach has tended to be more economic than otherwise. It's tended to dangle the prospect of economic gain. And of course, everybody wants to trade or needs to trade with China. And of course, that's a given. And so, I mean, the realities are as they are, and of course, we understand that, and everyone understands that. But it's the sort of the attempt to use infrastructure. We've seen in Africa. We've seen it even on the European continent after the 2008. 9 crisis, economic crisis. We saw a lot of assets in Europe being purchased at lower prices by the Chinese, ports and other forms of infrastructure, and this has been something that has been rather sort of has raised concerns in terms of how this could be used. We've seen the Chinese using particular companies like Nuke Tech to try to get to put its technology into scanners at airports and cargo cargo ports. We've seen the use of 5G. Of course, everybody who's been paying attention realizes that what's happening in China now, of course, is a 1984 kind of state where sort of Big Brother is watching you at every single point. And so, I mean, if the Chinese have been prepared to instrumentalize the COVID crisis, I mean, is it not logical to assume that they will also instrumentalize or weaponize the 5G network of the networks of the future? So this is something that really sort of does concern us, as we've heard our Secretary of State has been traveling around and been talking about this quite a lot, including in Slovenia a few weeks ago and other Central European countries, but talking about it all quite a lot. And so these are challenges that we face, especially now given how dependent we've seen how dependent we are on the digital space during the COVID crisis, where everybody needs to have a lot of bandwidth, etc. So this is clearly something that we have to watch. But the 3 Cs is an attempt is a really laudable attempt from our perspective. We're not members. We are observers. I call ourselves partners. We are, this is 12 Central European countries have gotten together and have decided that it's really better for them to generate their infrastructure growth themselves. To the extent possible. Of course, the EU assists greatly in the process already, but for all the IMF is now working on a study, which is a paper which is will be presented in September about the infrastructure needs of the 3 Cs region and some of the neighboring countries, and the infrastructure needs are really quite enormous. I mean, people, why should it take longer to drive from Warsaw to Sofia than it is from Warsaw to Paris? And I mean, it just the development case is so strong that the people have, the countries have decided that this is what they want to do. But then, of course, it does also have a strategic dimension to it, because the development case is persuasive. It's logical. It's overwhelmingly. It just makes a huge amount of sense. The trillion plus in infrastructure needs that are necessary in the transport, the digital, and the energy spheres. But it also has that other angle, so that because the countries, I think that you who are, who have, were forced to live under communism of one form or another for so many years, and made your cultural, your political decision to be part of the Western world. I'm told that's where so many want to stay, and see yourselves as part of so you tell me, part of the Western world, and this attempt by other powers, be it Russia, to weaken your institutions, weaken your connections to NATO, to the EU, etc., the transatlantic sphere, as well as the Chinese to try to corrupt or to otherwise turn your countries eastward and to forget about and not to, forget about that Atlanticist or forget about that European, that Western dimension. Those are concerning, and this also has a way of offering alternative sources of investment to the kinds of debt trap diplomacy that we've seen from China in so many other countries. Now, it's actually going in the last year since the Ljubljana summit of the Three Seas Initiative. We've actually come a fairly long way. We've got more and more countries have actually pledged publicly to make investments in the Three Seas Investment Fund. Now that fund has been up and running now for a number of months since February, March. With people actually looking at all the projects that have been set forward at the Bucharest summit, or in the meantime that have been come to their attention otherwise. You have a lot of so you have more countries making announcements. You know, Estonia, Latvia, Hungary, and then a number of other countries are very far down the list, the spectrum of actually making announcements before the Tallinn summit that will be held in October. So this is an opportunity right now we're at this point where this concept can actually be turned into reality after several years of preparatory work.
So it's a combination of strategic and development.
It is, and it's looking increasingly promising too as countries are realize that this is not a contribution to some project. This is actually an investment where there will be a return on investment, which means a profit. And so people are beginning to recognize, and plus in the post-COVID world, of course, you have the incredible potential that this has to kickstart or to infrastructure projects always generate other economic benefits that the Three Seas member states need themselves. And
yeah. I got some questions from the digital public here, and they're very much interested what is with the divisions regarding the security questions among the national states. I presume in European Union, this is a question from Katarina Karan, or the others from Andrei Novak, Berlin, European Cosmopolitan Consulting. How can the EU and NATO respond to hybrid threats and military aggression in our neighborhood if there is no common perception, for example, vis-à-vis Russia or China? This brings us to European Union and Mr. Paul Herczynski. European Union is very active in the past or last years in the area of new asymmetric hybrid security challenges, but still lacks many tools to cope with the situation. A lot of papers, but less deeds, I would say. Let's take, for example, the launching of strategic compass of the European Union to finally define, let's say, which are the common positions regarding the common security threats or common security perception in European Union. Can you tell us something how we will manage to finally have a common security perception in the European Union? Because we have some problems already in the Belarus case, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Milosic, for inviting me, for having me in the panel. I wish I could be sitting next to you, but in spite of the distance, let me contribute a few thoughts, and I will also try to answer to the questions that were just asked by few participants on the role of the European Union in cyber issues. So clearly, we have heard from all the speakers that there are many different ways in which our world has become less secure and far more challenging. Europe is facing a wide arch of instability, from the south with Libya and Sahel to the east with the newest situation in Belarus that you have mentioned, and of course with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And the rules-based order is under threat, and the COVID-19 that all the previous speakers have mentioned is adding to the security and defense challenges we are facing. So the conclusion is that the European Union needs to take more responsibility for its own security. This is what European citizens think, and this is also, by the way, the expectation of our partners around the world, that the EU should play a bigger role as a global security provider. And I'm very grateful to ASG of NATO, Bettina Kanderbach, for mentioning this complementary role of NATO and the European Union. So security and defense have become an integral part of the European project. This is important in our drive to build a more geopolitical union. It will also help to reinforce EU strategic autonomy. And again, I have to stress that the greater role of the EU in security and defense will at the same time strengthen NATO, since 21 EU member states are also NATO allies. A determined and more autonomous Europe, which can pull more of its own weight internationally, contributes also to wider transatlantic and global security. Defense cooperation at EU level means that EU member states are working together by pooling strength, expertise, and financial means to develop better capabilities and technologies in a more efficient manner that then could be done nationally. One very important additional point, what we call integrated approach. Namely, we know that diplomacy alone very often is not enough. Military means alone cannot secure lasting stability and peace. We have therefore created a wide array of policies and instruments that link up our diplomatic efforts with those in the areas of security, defense, finance, trade, development cooperation, humanitarian aid. This is all what EU can put on the table in case of any particular crisis. Of course, at the same time, we have developed many new initiatives: permanent structured cooperation, European Defence Fund, European Peace Facility. And here I couldn't agree more with the Slovenian defense minister, saying that now is the time to deliver implementation. So we are working very hard with our member states to have first results of permanent structured cooperation. Very important, European Defence Fund that should coordinate, supplement, and amplify national investments in defense research. Here, the last European Council has decided to put real money on the table. Why is it important? Because at the moment, 90% of defense research and 80% of defense procurement in the European Union are run on national basis, which has led to a multiplicity of defense systems and fragmentation of the European defense sector. So this is what we want to change. Another key project that hopefully we will be managed to start beginning of next year, European Peace Facility. This new initiative is meant to support the capacity building of EU partners, allowing, for instance, the purchase of military equipment. At the last European Council, EPF has been allocated 5 billion euro. So the potential of this new instrument is really considerable. Now coming back to hybrid threats, clearly threats to security, to our networks, societies, and democracies can come from both state and non-state actors. EU is therefore further exploring civilian and military synergies in areas such as situational awareness, countering chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, resilience, cyber, countering hybrid threats, and strategic communications. On cyber threats, I'm particularly proud of what we have achieved in the European Union over the last couple of years. Namely, we have agreed with our member states that what applies offline applies in the same way online. so that we can use all our instruments at hand in order to react to cyber threats, both focusing on EU member states as well as our partners. And I hope you have noticed that at the end of July, we have put first listings on our autonomous EU cyber sanctions regime. So there are several individuals and several entities coming from 3 different countries that have been sanctioned by the European Union because of their role in malicious cyber activities. Let me end with 2 very important points. Beyond our policies and toolboxes, there are also the women and men, 2,000 civilian and 2,500 military staff that are currently deployed abroad in our CSDP missions in operations, 11 civilian and 6 military CSDP missions in operations. And finally, to go into your question on the strategic compacts, the Council, so the member states, have tasked us to develop a comprehensive analysis of the full range of threats and challenges which the EU is facing. This will provide the background for developing a strategic compass to be adopted by the Council in 2022. Building on our global strategy, the strategic compass should further contribute to develop the common European security and defense culture. The strategic compass will define policy orientations and specific goals and objectives in areas such as crisis management, so our missions and operations, resilience, capability development, and partnerships. It will also provide the strategic guidance for the implementation of the security and defense initiatives that I have already mentioned in my brief presentation. At the moment, we are busy with our member states, trying to engage into deeper discussions. As I said, a year and a half, and hopefully early 2022, we will have a strategic compass agreed by 27 EU member states. Thank you, back to you.
A lot of things are happening in the EU, but the buzzword remains implementation, if I'm not mistaken. And finally, we with Dr. Matthew Rhodes, Marshall Center's Balkans 360 initiative has engaged experts and alumni from the region on emerging regional security challenges and how this COVID-19 pandemic, including hybrid and information issues, basically fit into the picture. If you can explain us a little bit about it.
No, thank you, Iztok, for the opportunity to be here. As the 7th speaker of the panel, I'm in the classic position where everything has been said, but not by me. So I will try to be relatively brief, but address these points that you've asked. 2 years ago, the Marshall Center, which is a German-American Security Studies Institute in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, launched what we've called the Balkans 360 initiative. It was in part a reaction to some comments by NATO's then Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Scaparrotti, who told the US Senate that it was precisely the Balkans that was the area in Europe of greatest concern to him. He saw the greatest prospect for instability and spillover. So we started off by holding a series of workshops featuring senior Marshall Center alumni from the region. People who were ambassadors, general officers, deputy ministers, similar to the audience you've had here today. And this theme of disinformation was one that came up over and over, maybe more than I would have expected myself. And while a lot of the concern focused on the activities of Russia in the region, as we've heard from a couple of the past speakers, there was also increasing focus on China. And that, I think, is, if anything, been reinforced by the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic this year. Again, there were even some references by President Vučić and others of the morning speakers to this experience. But back in March and early April, both Russia and China took advantage, essentially, of the slower response by EU and NATO to present themselves as saviors, bringing humanitarian aid, medical supplies, and so forth to help countries combat the coronavirus. I think China already had plane loads in Greece and Serbia by March 21st, and shortly thereafter, Russia was in Italy and Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Nothing wrong with that per se, but as others have said, it became mixed up by those countries' governments in a broader disinformation campaign, changing the views of how the virus got started, disparaging the ability of democracies to combat a pandemic. And so I think in part, in response to that, we've come up with some ideas and looked at governments who have come up with ideas. Part of it is simply that there needs to be a little bit of a pushback on that kind of disinformation. Not only the pointing it out, but perhaps going a little bit deeper and explaining that, in fact, a lot of the aid that was delivered by Russia and China had a kind of Potemkin quality. Countries across Europe, from Spain to Finland to Bulgaria, actually had to return a lot of the Chinese masks that were delivered because they didn't meet the necessary medical standards. Likewise with Russia, which delivered some soil sanitation vehicles to Bergamo, Italy. This looked fairly impressive on television, but in fact was not of much use in stopping the spread of the coronavirus. So I think it's fair to point out those things, especially in the context of countries who are using it for disinformation. Over the broader period, however, I think it's not just a question of this kind of reactive fact-checking, but the second response has to be this term that we've heard a lot of on this panel, and that is building resilience. Helping countries, helping ourselves, and helping partner countries in Southeast Europe and elsewhere in a way develop a kind of immunity against disinformation. So again, it's not just a case-by-case identifying misinformation, but that they're ready to recognize it, ready to resist the influence of this. And in principle, at least, this should be a project that is tailor-made for transatlantic US-NATO cooperation. Resilience, excuse me. Resilience has already been an issue on the, thank you, Chris. That doesn't count against my time. No, okay. Resilience has already been on the agenda for both NATO and the EU for a number of years. As again was mentioned back in 2016, it was really the central theme of the EU global strategy. It was one of the listed activities for the NATO-EU strategic partnership, which was also declared at the Warsaw Summit that year. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really back. We've heard it's part of the strategic compass for the EU. It was a central feature also specifically relative to China for the US strategic approach to China document that was published in May of this year. And so I think given that kind of all the partners have identified this as a necessary priority, that they already have some precedents of cooperation on this, this is exactly the type of unifying project that can, I think, be a great thing to work on at a time when there are differences on a number of other public issues. So as we heard kind of a question about how can we have a common approach, a common assessment. Yet another process that should start next month is a strategic dialogue on China between the United States and the European Union. And so I would hope and expect that also dealing with disinformation and building resilience against it will be a central part of that dialogue. In the meantime, on a more modest level, the Marshall Center is continuing to do some workshops, specifically in the region of Southeast Europe on that. And from next year, we will have a one-week course once a year, again, focused on the 11 countries, broadly considering Southeast Europe, to help build this common understanding and build resilience against disinformation. Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
We are almost there. Now I will open for the floor for very brief comments or questions, if there are questions. Or Dr. Prezel.
Thank you. Prezel Istok, Faculty of Social Sciences, Vice Dean. Thank you for very interesting and thought-stimulating points. But my question is here about the predictions about the future. We talked a lot about problems and not so much about solutions, and the situation is very uncertain. You basically talked about different kinds of military crises erupting and emerging. We didn't touch so much about arms control crisis, which is also an issue. We have to solve this in the midst of the COVID crisis, in the midst of coming economic crisis. China is coming, hybrid threats, and the last speaker referred to disinformation campaigns. So governments, European governments, have a lot on the table, a lot of threats, and actually they're not dealing only with one crisis, they're dealing with several crises, and the question is there a single institution or is there a single plan which can help us in overcoming this situation? So in this unfortunate situation of several crises on the table, the question is, what is your prediction? And when we talk about predictions, normally we have worst case, best case, least probable, most probable. Having a military commander here, I would say that Bled Strategic Forum is probably not the best place to talk about worst cases. So let's be optimistic and positive and see what we can take out of this unfortunate situation. And I'm also very glad to be able to pose questions in physical space, some of our speakers.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Any other comment or question? No? If not, then maybe I can use the question of Dr. Prezel to make final comments by all of our participants. And this is, what are your predictions regarding the security in our continent? And if we use Mrs. Kanderbach, if we use your opportunity to be with us, can you start? What are the predictions of NATO regarding security threats and positive and optimistic solutions for the continent?
We are very optimistic, as we always are, because we know our strengths. We also know where we need to work together with others in order to build on our strengths. So in order to answer the question, it's not possible for any single organization or any single country to solve all these crises. But when we work together and we are really building on working together and drawing together and building on each other's strengths, in that case, we are in a position to do that. Look, NATO right now, what we are already doing is that we try to be more coordinated among allies also in other international fora. That works very well in some parts. We did that on the Open Skies Treaty. We did that on the Vienna document. So there we are united. We have the same message, which makes us stronger. When we continue to do that, and that brings me back to the initial remark I made on the non-military instruments of powers, that's exactly what we need to be doing. So it's the sanctions, which is not NATO's domain, but others can do that. Then we look at diplomacy, we look at political action, economic action, at everything together. If this is a coherent package, then we have the answers, we can provide, we can deliver, and then we can hold our own.
Minister Tonin.
Future will be complicated, no doubt. That's why we have to be prepared to act swiftly. That's why we have to invest in security. Even Slovenia. And if you want to be a global power, as Europe, I assume, wants to be, then you need three things. You need strong military, you need united diplomacy, and you need strong economy. We have Euro. We are building on diplomacy, but we still have to speak with a common voice. We are still not. And we have many institutions, projects which are building European military capabilities. So I'm positive but cautious at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mrs. Hirjola?
Oh, well, predictions are difficult. I think I always try to be an optimist, but it's very difficult right now to predict indeed, given also the COVID situation. I mean, we do know that the security situation in the OSCE region, and I mean the larger sort of, let's say, Europe plus the 57 participating states included is evolving, and there are worrying elements, and there is the danger of let's say narrow national agendas also undermining the common good. So we're facing a lot of different issues at the same time. Then on top of this COVID, at the same time, the OSCE is a consensus-based organization. So updating some of the, shall we say, the documents, meaning the agreements that all the participating states have made with each other, such as, for example, the Vienna document, which is about the confidence and security building measures, is a challenge. So it's difficult to outline, let's say, concrete actions like that, and to say we will at whether it's the upcoming ministerial or the following one, we will do something drastic. At the same time, I would say, when we talked about resilience earlier, that one of the reasons why I was so happy to join that organization is because actually the OSCE is doing a lot of good constantly, and it's sort of it's on the very practical level. We're building the resilience of countries. We talked about resilience in the context of hybrid threats, but I think resilience is about building countries, and in this case, those countries where we have field operations, for example, resilience as strong societies. Then they will be able to address hybrid threats. They will be able to address economic threats, social threats. There will be, it's all about conflict prevention. It's all about crisis management. So I'm not that pessimistic, but at the same time, I don't have a solution at hand to tell you right now how we will resolve the problems of the world.
Thank you very much. Maybe General Cavoli has some solutions.
Sure, yeah, I got solutions. And no predictions, worst case predictions from a military guy are bad indeed. I think it's clear that the competition to gain access, influence, and dominance in the information sphere in Europe will continue and increase. I think that it's clear that each of our countries should invest in recognizing this, both individually and collectively, so that we see when activities that seem to be normal, benign, peacetime activities actually have a security dimension in the second or third order. I think it's very important for us to invest in that, both intellectually and financially. And then finally, I just call everybody's attention to the ultimate point, which is when competition culminates in the wrong way, hard power is required, even today.
Thank you, Mr. Boyce.
So I'm actually also an optimist in some respects, although I must say that I think that the competition that we're in between democracies, our democracies, and authoritarian states, dictatorships, whatever, autocrats, whatever you want to call them, that will continue, and that is going to be the template from here on in. I can't imagine that changing much. So we have to, I think, prepare ourselves for the long haul in that respect, and that means in every single way. Whether we like it or not, there are alternative models out there that are presenting themselves as sort of more successful than our democracies, and that's a message that is resonating in parts of our populations, but it's also, people are catching on. I think the COVID crisis, for all of the damage it's done to our societies and economies, it's also had, I think a lot of people have actually seen through what some of the malign actors are up to, and that's actually encouraging, because you recognize behavior patterns, and this is, the awareness of the challenge, I think, has grown rather significantly, and that's also encouraging, because we've been seeing a lot of governments increasingly concerned about this, taking steps of all different kinds to insulate themselves, to strengthen their resilience, and to deal with this long-term challenge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herczynski.
Clearly, there is no single institution, and there is no single plan to face all the challenges. Everyone has a role to play, and every organization represented in this panel, be it European Union, be it NATO, be it OSCE, has a role to play. Transatlantic link, extremely important to keep the US engagement in Europe. When it comes to the internal EU homework, we work on three work strands: unity, solidarity, resilience, together with 27 member states. And finally, multilateralism and rules-based world order. Collectively, we have to defend what we have been creating for last decades. It managed to keep us successful, and we should avoid undermining multilateralism and the rules-based world order, or to be mirrored by alternative models. Thank you.
Thank you. And Matt?
Yeah, very briefly, his talk. I think the proliferation and intensification of threats that you've laid out mean that perhaps things will get worse before they get better. But if there's hope, as others have said, it's not in kind of one process, one institution, but perhaps what one of my other faculty member colleagues at the Marshall Center has called this bouquet of strategic reviews and reflections that we are in the middle of, that show that we at least collectively recognize that significant change is needed, and that if we can do these different processes seriously and hopefully in a somewhat coordinated manner, we may become stronger in the end.
Thank you very much. If I may conclude, I think that we noticed regarding the security in Europe a couple of points. One is that we should combine soft and hard security. Still, that probably hybrid and cyber security will be of dominance in the next decade, that we should lean on dialogue and multilateralism still, and predominantly that we have to work with partners, means EU, NATO, OSCE, and transatlantic US. This is probably the hardest security stock that we have in our hands, and whether we would like or not, we have a new player in our ground, because all of us mentioned it, and this is China. And Slovenia, I think, is counting on our partners, and Slovenia will be a good partner to partners and allies for us. I would like to thank all the participants for participating in this panel, and I would like particularly to thank audience that appeared in a physical form in front of us. Thank you very much, and good luck. And do not leave the hall, because it will be a nice celebration, a short one but very nice one. Thank you very much.